Morning. Is this loud enough? I can be louder if you need me to. We'll go ahead and get started. I have a lot of material this morning, so we're going to go ahead and start. Thanks for being here. Thanks for making the right accommodations, being back here. It's not quite done up front. It's done enough to where we possibly could have done it, but it would have been a lot of cleaning and a lot of work and all that. So, and some of the pews aren't anchored down very good. So we don't need anyone tipping over any pews. That wouldn't be good. So we're continuing in Matthew chapter 22. We started this chapter last week. And keep in mind the context of this. Jesus has just entered Jerusalem. He did that at the beginning of chapter 21. And this is the point where the story begins to slow down considerably. And the purpose of that is the writers are showing us some things and they're slowing down the story. And so it's kind of emphatic in that way. And what we're doing is we're building our way slowly but surely to the climax of not just Matthew's gospel, but of the whole Bible, which is, of course, Jesus' death, burial, and then eventual resurrection. So we looked at some of that last week. We also see that at this point in the chapter, Jesus is in the midst of a discussion with the Jewish leaders. And so the dynamic of this conversation, it's beginning to grow more and more hostile. We see that at the end of chapter 21, the Jews wanted to arrest Jesus. And so this is the context of their conversation. They're trying to arrest Jesus, and so we'll see that they begin to try to entrap him, and so on and so forth. And so Jesus is dealing with hostile listeners. And so we're getting into now the next section. And what we looked at last week is he told the Jewish leaders a triad of parables toward the end of chapter 21 and then the first part of chapter 22. And the common thread of these parables, the three that Jesus tells them, is that of the failure of their leadership, the failure of the Jews' leadership. They are like what the prophet Ezekiel described. They're like shepherds that are actually devouring the flock and not like shepherds who are trying to tend to the flock. And so because of their failure as leaders and because of then their failure, the failure of the Jewish religion and the fact that they were not holding up their end of the covenant, God is going to turn over the kingdom from the Jews to the church. And so that's what we're seeing here, and that's what we just saw with these parables. And so now coming off of these parables, the interaction again is hostile, and we're going to see it elevate a little bit here, where what we see happening is the Jewish leaders who, keep in mind with these parables, their leadership has been indicted. Their shortcomings have been highlighted, and they know that. And what we see happening now is they begin to challenge Jesus. And what you see happening here, it's kind of interesting how Matthew is depicting all of this. It's not one single sect of Judaism that's singled out. You have all of them kind of included in this. The Pharisees come in first with the Herodians in verses 15 through 22. Then the Sadducees come in verses 23 through 33. And then a lawyer who is also a Pharisee comes in verses 34 through 40. And they all are approaching Jesus and they're looking to trap him. That's the nature of these interactions. And what ends up happening, as typically is the case, is Jesus not only escapes their traps, but he ends up trapping them instead. And so the first part that we're going to look at here this morning in Matthew 22 is as the Pharisees and the Herodians come and they challenge Jesus. And so this is Matthew 22, starting in verse 15. They ask about paying taxes to Caesar. This is a pretty well-known interaction. It says, Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. So right off the bat, we see here at the beginning of this, in verse 15, their motivation. Their motivation in coming to Jesus, it's not genuine. They're not actually looking for information. They're looking to entangle him in his words. That's how the English Standard Version puts it. They went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. So, in other words, what they're trying to do is they're trying to get Jesus to say something that he shouldn't say, something that they can incriminate him based on. And obviously, Jesus is not going to succumb to that. Notice first what they do. Keep in mind the motivation. They want to entrap Jesus. But first, they butter him up a little bit, like a biscuit or a roll. We see they send their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Notice first that they address him as teacher, which is a sign of respect. Jesus is, of course, a teacher. And they also call him true. They say, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully. And you don't care about one's opinion, for you're not swayed by appearances." What it seems is that this is an attempt perhaps to get Jesus to let his guard down. We know you're from God. We know you're true. They call him teacher. Well, this is a little ironic in the sense that based on their intentions, you can assume that they don't actually mean what they're saying, but the things they're saying are actually true. It's sort of like when they crucify Jesus and they have the title above him, King of the Jews. Well, it's actually true in an ironic way. Another aspect of this is the fact that they are calling Jesus true. It presents a big contrast with themselves, who Jesus will describe here and in various other places as hypocrites. And so on the one hand, you have Jesus who is true, who is from God, and then you have these Jews who are hypocritical. They're saying one thing and doing something entirely different. It is presenting a pretty big contrast, especially thinking about Jesus's or thinking about Matthew's readers who would have perhaps been Jews, perhaps wrapped up in Judaism, but thinking about becoming a Christian. The contrast really couldn't be any clearer. So they continue to butter up Jesus, and they go on to say that you don't care about appearances. You don't care about what people think. Perhaps what they are trying to do here is attempting to tee up Jesus to speak something against the Roman government. What they're going to ask is about paying taxes to Caesar. Is it lawful or is it not? And in saying you don't care about someone's opinion, they're almost trying to get him to speak against Rome. And if he does that, they can accuse him of treason and the Romans will kill him. And so that's perhaps some of what is going on here with their tactics, trying to entrap him, trying to pin him against Rome. And if that doesn't work, then they have another backup plan. So they butter him up, and then they ask Jesus the question. And again, this is to trap him. They're looking to trap Jesus in his words. And the question, as it reads in verse 17, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Is it lawful to pay taxes? This seems initially to be a lose-lose answer. And this is probably why they asked the question in the first place, as they concocted it. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? If he says, no, it's not lawful, they can accuse him of treason. He's saying you shouldn't pay your taxes. He'd get arrested and probably killed for that. Or if he says, yes, it is lawful, then he looks bad to the other Jews. They could say he's a traitor. He's siding with Rome. He's just like those tax collectors. And so this perhaps would seem like a lose-lose question, and that is probably why they ask it, trying to make Jesus look bad no matter what. Well, as has been the case throughout Matthew's gospel account, Jesus is fully aware of their malice toward him. The Son of God, of course, is all-knowing. And so he asked them the question, why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Interestingly, they're doing just as Satan had done in Matthew chapter 4. It's the same word that's used. We think of the temptation of Jesus when Satan came and tempted him. But the same word in the original language is used here when Jesus says, why put me to the test? And so what we see is the Jews are following the pattern that their father, Satan, as Jesus says in John's gospel, they're doing the works of their father. So they're doing just as Satan did. And he also calls them hypocrites, which again contrasts them with how they sort of ironically describe Jesus in verse 16 when they said that he was true. So on the one hand, you have Jesus who is true. You have these Jews who are behaving very hypocritically. And so Jesus is aware of their malice, and Jesus has the right answer. And really, it's masterful in a sense where, as we read at the conclusion of this, they end up marveling and they just go away. So he has a masterful answer for them. First, he has them bring him the coin. This is intentional. That way he can show them. He can ask them whose inscription and image is on this. That way there's something tangible to look at. And so he has them show him the coin, the denarius, which is again a day's wage for a laborer. So he has them show the coin. And this is a little ironic because they had this coin in their possession, and these Jewish leaders did not like having Roman coins in their possession. They felt that that was a betrayal to their Jewish faith. And so they usually, and this is why if you went to the temple, they had money changers there. They wouldn't let you use Roman coins in the temple. You had to get a Jewish coin instead. And yet they have one of these coins on their possession to show Jesus. This highlights further the hypocrisy of what they have going on. And then he asked them again, whose likeness and inscription is on it? And again, it's Caesar. Caesar is the emperor of Rome. He's in charge of the government. It's his image that's on the coin. And so they show him the coin. They say it's Caesar who's on the coin. And then what you have happen is the climax of this interaction in verse 21, where Jesus said, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. You hear this talked about a lot, and it's usually in terms of Christians who don't want to pay taxes, and this is what people will answer to us. I'm including myself in there because who likes paying taxes? But we have to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, right? What we owe the government or what the government says we owe, I guess. We have to pay them. The word here that's translated as render literally means to pay back or to return. And so the idea behind this is to return to someone what is rightfully theirs. And so for Caesar, and you could think of it in this way in a monetary sense, the government is the one who distributes the currency, and so they take a portion of it back, right? And so for Caesar, they're just returning what really is rightfully his, since he's the emperor. And this is ironic because while all of this is going on, they were failing to return to God what was his. And this paints a direct parallel with one of the parables we looked at in chapter 21, the parable of the tenants. Where again, if you look back at that parable in chapter 21, the whole idea is there's a master of a vineyard. He wants the fruit of his vineyard. It's rightfully his fruit. He's the owner of the vineyard, but the tenants won't give it to him. There, Jesus is showing that that's how they are. They are not giving God what is rightfully his. And you see again here in chapter 22, this same contrast. And you can see it in how they responded when Jesus asks, this is in 21 and verse 40, when therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? And they said, he'll put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruit in their seasons. Well, this is an indictment against these Jewish leaders. They're not giving God the fruit that's due him. And here we see it again. They ask about giving to Caesar. Really, they need to be worried about giving to God what is his, which they have not been doing. And so this is the first interaction, Jesus with the Pharisees and the Herodians. The next interaction comes from the Sadducees. And so they are the ones who come next. One thing that's interesting, you have all these different sects of the Jewish religion here. You have the Pharisees, the Herodians, the Sadducees. They're usually pinned against each other. But they are united against Jesus. And that's something you see further if you dive into the book of Acts. So now the Sadducees come, and starting in verse 23, they ask about the resurrection. It says, the same day Sadducees came to him, who say there is no resurrection. That's an important editorial note that Matthew gives. And they ask him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring left his wife to his brother. So too the second and third down to the 7th. After them all the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. But Jesus answered them, You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. So this is a really interesting interaction now moving to with the Sadducees. Unlike the Pharisees who do believe in the resurrection, and you kind of see Paul, the apostle, pin them against each other for this in the book of Acts, the Sadducees do not believe in a resurrection. And Matthew adds that editorial note in verse 23. They say that there is no resurrection. And the reason for that, it seems, and Steve a couple years ago preached a sermon on this and drew out more of the nuance of this, but it seems that the Sadducees were influenced pretty heavily by Greek philosophy and the naturalism that comes from that. And what naturalism is if there's something that doesn't seem natural, then it must not be real, right? And so something like a resurrection that doesn't seem natural, and so they don't believe in it. And so they don't believe in a resurrection. And they come and they ask Jesus what really, when you study the nuance of it, is an absurd question. And it's absurd in a few different ways. First, you have the premise of the question. And the premise of the question is based on what is commonly called the Levirate marriage. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this is a concept that comes from Deuteronomy chapter 25. And the concept is if a man dies and he's married and he leaves his widow without any children, then his brother is obligated to marry that widow so that she can have children. That seems really weird to us, but that was what the law was for the Jews back then. Keep in mind, we're living in a different time and a different context. And so if it seems weird to us, that's why. But that was how it was as Moses outlined it. We see it, another part of their question, it's also based on the premise of one woman being widowed and childless by 7 brothers. I would think after the 3rd or 4th brother, you'd say, okay, enough, lady. And you got to ask the question, what are the chances of this even happening? What are the chances of one woman being widowed by 7 brothers? That seems pretty absurd, at least to me. I could see 1 or 2, but 7, that seems like a little much. And so you can see the absurdity kind of building up here. It's based on a weird premise that doesn't come up all that often, and it's based on that premise being applied in a really absurd sort of context. And so then comes the question. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, these 7 brothers, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. Notice the premise of the question is based on this law from Deuteronomy 25, but the question itself is actually about the resurrection. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And this further highlights the absurdity of their question because they're asking about something that they do not even believe in. You can almost read into the tone of them asking the question, maybe in a mocking sort of manner, pointing out what they view to be an absurd belief, and yet their question is absurd in and of itself. So they're asking about something that they don't even believe in, which is why Jesus explains to them about the resurrection at the end of this interaction. And so Jesus addresses their absurd question. We see his answer starting in verse 29. First, he tells them they don't know the Scriptures, nor do they know the power of God. That's a pretty strong indictment against the Sadducees. These are people who worked closely within the temple. The priests were included in the Sadducee sect. They were kind of closely associated with them. they probably, maybe not as much as the Pharisees would have, but they would have prided themselves in being knowledgeable about the scriptures. Well, here Jesus tells them, you don't know the scriptures, nor do you know the power of God. Their naturalistic position is, in fact, denying the power of God. And so in verse 29, he says, you are wrong because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. And then he corrects their presumptions, which are wrong presumptions. Otherwise, they wouldn't need correcting. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. It's kind of an interesting tidbit about the resurrection, which is something that we hope to be part of. When we are raised, we see here that they are not given in marriage, or they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit that Jesus points out here. So he corrects them, and he also corrects their presumption about the resurrection in pointing out that he's not the God of the dead, but of the living. And this, of course, astonishes the crowd. And so you can kind of see the reactions here that Matthew points out. After the first interaction, they marveled. Now, after this interaction, they are astonished at his teaching. Next, we come to this third interaction. And so after silencing the Sadducees, what you have is a lawyer comes. And before we read, I'll point out that a lawyer, as Matthew is depicting it, some of your versions might translate it a little differently. My version calls it a lawyer. But a lawyer is sort of like what our lawyers are. They're experts of the law. And so this is an expert of the Jewish law, of the law of Moses. And these were typically scribes. Scribes were the ones who wrote down the hand copies of the law of Moses. And because they've hand copied it so often, they had it memorized and were extremely familiar with it, so they were considered experts. And in fact, sometimes were teachers of the law. And so that's what a lawyer is as you read it here in Matthew's gospel account. It's not some guy that wears an expensive suit and prances into a courtroom and all of that. It's not one of those lawyers. And so let's read this interaction. Matthew 22, picking up in verse 34. And this is another pretty well-known interaction. But when the Pharisees, excuse me, when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So again, there's this lawyer that approaches Jesus. And what's interesting about this is an expert of the law. And this law expert comes and he asks Jesus a question about the law. It's incredibly ironic. People would normally come to him and ask him questions about the law because he was a lawyer, he was an expert in it. And yet he's going and asking Jesus. This is ironic, but it's also truthful because there's no greater expert in the law of Moses than Jesus, right? But we see the intention again behind this lawyer. In verse 35, we see that he asked him a question to test him. So again, you can see the motivation. And it's worth pointing out again, Jesus is dealing with a hostile group of people. They are hostile toward him. And so for this period of time, Jesus is constantly playing defense, but he does so pretty masterfully. So the teacher asks this question. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And again, this is a question where, depending on how Jesus answers, this would be a pretty easy one to get wrong. And you can kind of read into the lawyer's intentions in asking such a question. Jesus could have simply given no answer. They did this for Jesus. Jesus asked them questions, and they would say, we don't have an answer, or we don't know. Jesus could have done that, but if he had, they could have portrayed him as a novice, as someone who, claiming to be a teacher, he doesn't know about the law, right? What kind of teacher doesn't know the answer to that question? So if he gives no answer, they're going to portray him as a novice. But if he gives any answer, if he names any particular command besides the one that he does, they could accuse him of belittling the other laws. And so you can see no matter what Jesus answers, they're going to try to turn this against him. And so Jesus has to be careful. And again, as always, Jesus gives the perfect answer. I don't think you could even answer this question in any other way without them taking offense to it one way or the other. But Jesus gives the perfect and most balanced answer. And so he says in verse 37, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And this, of course, is taken from Deuteronomy chapter 6. This is a pretty important chapter in the Hebrew Bible. This is known as the Shema, the Great Confession, right? You shall love the Lord your God, so on and so forth. And so it begins with, Hear, O Israel. That's the word Shema means hear. And so this was pretty well known and pretty important. And so this is the great command to love God. That's the greatest commandment that we can have. And even though he's not asked this here, he gives the second greatest command, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. And that particular quotation comes from Leviticus chapter 19. So Jesus gives two answers here, loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. And this is why this is the perfect answer. Because as Jesus says in verse 40, on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. And what that means is these two kind of summarize the whole law. And when you think about it, if you're obeying these two things, if you're loving God with all of your heart and so on, and if you're loving your neighbor as yourself, if you're truly doing that, you're going to keep the rest of the 100 some odd laws that are in the Bible. Because if you love God, you're going to keep his commands, right? Jesus makes that point a couple different times. And so on these two commands depend all the law and the prophets. They not only summarize the law and the prophets, but if you're following these two, then you'll, by nature, keep the other ones. And so this is the perfect answer. And notice that no response is given, as Matthew depicts it. In other depictions of this interaction, there is a response, but there's nothing here as Matthew is describing this, which is, of course, an indictment on what this lawyer is wanting to do. He's wanting to test Jesus, and Jesus passes the test better than anyone else could. So there's been all these interactions with Jesus, and he's been having to play defense. Well, now the nature of the conversation changes, because starting in verse 41, now Jesus is the one asking them a question. And so after playing defense, Jesus can take offense now. He can play offense. And unlike his opponents, Jesus' question that he is going to ask actually is something worth asking. It's actually something that has some substance to it. And so starting in verse 41, it says, Now while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, The son of David. And he said to them, How is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. So Jesus is able to play offense here. And his question is, what do you think about the Christ? And notice who he's asking the question. It's the Pharisees who are considered the experts, right? These are the religious experts. These are the pious ones. These are the holier than thou people. They would have claimed to have had an answer to this question. And Jesus asked them, Who do you think, or what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? He doesn't outright say that this is him, but he's indirectly asking them a question about himself, because he is the Christ, right? We read that in Matthew 16. Peter made that confession. You're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. And so from that point on in Matthew, it's pretty clear, if you're reading it for the first time, Jesus is the Christ. So he's indirectly asking them a question about himself. And so the answer to this question reveals something about him. And this is the intention in what Jesus is doing here. He's not playing gotcha with them, although that is kind of what ends up happening. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to show them something about himself. And so he asked this question, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? And the Pharisees give what would have been their prototypical answer. They say the son of David. And this is based, of course, on 2 Samuel 7, also 1 Chronicles 17, which is the sermon this morning. And so they say it's the son of David. It's David's son. And this is the promise. We'll dive more into this at the 11 o'clock hour of David wants to build a house for God. This is where God says, you're not building me a house. I'm going to build you a house. He's talking about a dynasty there. And there's a descendant or a seed of David who's going to have this eternal kingdom. And the Jews had this expectation that there's a son of David who would come and who would sit on the throne forever. And in their minds, they thought of this as an earthly throne, an earthly kingdom, someone who's going to come and who's going to take back, he's going to take back Israel from the Roman control. What's interesting is they answer, well, it's the son of David. And their answer isn't technically incorrect, right? They're kind of right. Matthew, in this gospel, we've seen it periodically that Jesus is the son of David. In fact, the opening lines of Matthew's gospel is the book of the genealogy of Jesus, the son of Abraham, son of David, right? And so they're not wrong, but their answer is still lacking because he's not just the son of David. He's, in fact, much more than that. And so Jesus is trying to show them something about himself. And what Jesus draws their attention to are the words of King David in Psalm 110. This psalm, interestingly, is among the most quoted or certainly alluded to Old Testament passages in the entirety of the New Testament. It's quoted a handful of times, and each quotation has its own certain nuance to it. You can look in Hebrews for certain aspects of it. Well, here, Jesus is showing the fact that David referred to Christ as Lord. And in the quotation, it says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. So he's showing here that David refers to this person who is the Christ. And this also shows that the implication here is Psalm 110 was understood as a messianic psalm in that period of time. And here David is referring to Christ as Lord. And here's kind of the crux of the issue is if this is David's son, then why would he call him Lord? Father's not going to refer to his son as his Lord. That's just not going to happen. And that was especially true in that period of time. And so Jesus asked the question, if then David calls him Lord, how is he his son? And so you can kind of see what Jesus is doing here without outright saying it, because if he outright said it, they would arrest him and kill him right there. But without saying it, Jesus is strongly implying that not only is he that son of David figure that they had been waiting for, Matthew's made it abundantly clear that Jesus is the son of David, but he's showing us here that he's also the son of God. He's not just the son of David, but he's God's son. And this, of course, says something much more about Jesus, because this highlights not only his authority to be perhaps an earthly king if he is a descendant of David, which he is, but we also see the authority that he has in terms of spiritual things because he is God's son. And that's something, again, that Matthew has made clear to us as well. Think about when Jesus is baptized, there's the voice from heaven that says, this is my beloved son with whom I'm well pleased, right? And then at the transfiguration in Matthew 17, James and John and Peter are there with him, and they hear the voice from heaven saying, this is my beloved son with whom I'm well pleased. But then there's the addition where he says, hear him or listen to him. That, of course, alludes to the prophecy of the prophet like Moses, who they were to listen to, right? And so Jesus is showing much more here about himself. He's showing that not only is he the son of David, but he is also the son of God. And that also is an indictment against the Jewish leaders, because this is who they're trying to arrest. This is who they're trying to entrap. They're trying to kill God's son. This is something that is very clearly an indictment against them even further. And that's going to tie in with the next chapter with Matthew 23, the 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees. And as we see, this chapter ends in verse 46 with saying, "No one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions." Notice the ending of each of these interactions. In the first interaction, where the Pharisees and the Herodians come and they ask about paying taxes to Caesar, that interaction ends in saying, when they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. So first they marvel. Then with the interaction with the Sadducees, it says when the crowd heard it, they were astonished. So we have marveling, we have astonishment. There's not even an ending mentioned after the interaction with the lawyer. It just abruptly goes into the next section. So you can imply that that was also a silent response as well. And now here in verse 46, we say that no one was able to answer him a word. They have no rebuttal for what Jesus has said, because how do you answer that, right? And so no one's able to answer him a word. And not only that, but they realize, okay, we can't go on asking him questions anymore. Not only is he dodging their punches, but he's punching back and he's making them look like fools. So we see no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. Now they know what they're dealing with. And so they're going to end up raising the stakes. Any comments or questions? Thanks for your attention.